Tervetuloa. I wish you all welcome to Finnish National Defense University Annual Russia Seminar. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Simo Pesu and the team leader of the Russia Research Group on the Department of Warfare. On the background, you will see in a moment our organizing team. Katri Pynnöniemi and Pentti Forsström will host and lead us through the discussions during today and next Tuesday, the 2nd of February. We found it more comfortable to choose 2 suitable days separately than one day after each other. We have a great hope that you attendees will find it similarly comfortable. Very warmly, I greet our distinguished speakers. We highly appreciate that you found the time for our venue and audience to share your thoughts on Russian security and military thinking. We organizers have a humble wish to see our Russian colleagues, academics, in this venue too in future. Political spin is not very interesting, but serious discussion on security and military thinking is essential. And without further speaking, next I will invite Director of National Defense University, Major General Jari Kallio, to open the seminar. Major General, floor is yours.
So, thank you. Sir, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to the 3rd International Russia Seminar of Finnish National Defense University. Last year, the seminar was cancelled due to COVID pandemic, and this year the seminar is held entirely virtually due to the same reason. The main topic of this seminar is Russia's concept of deterrence, and the objectives is multidimensional. Firstly, the seminar brings together scholars and experts from different countries. The Russia Research Group of our university has brought together scholars from Great Britain, United States, Sweden, Norway, the Netherlands, and Lithuania. Unfortunately, our Russian colleagues are absent. I would like to express my gratitude to all the speakers for taking time to contribute to a theme that touches all of us. The virtual environment allows for a new kind of interaction between scholars and experts. We all must adapt to current circumstances, and so has the Russia seminar too. We hoped that next year we could meet normal way, face to face again. The second objective of the seminar is bring out new information and different perspectives of Russia's interpretation of deterrence, how Russia approaches the concept, how Russia's thinking has changed, and what feature of Soviet thought can still be identified today. Not to forget the value of historical and methodological starting points. It is expected that some questions will remain open despite our seminar. But don't worry, the work is already ongoing. Next year, Finnish National Defense University will organize the 4th Russia seminar. The third objective of the seminar is to contribute to the understanding of the debate on the issue and highlight aspects that are relevant to the various actors in trying to explain and understand the Russia starting points and thinking. The Russia seminar offers a platform where we can discuss in a public debate a recent research of Russian thinking in terms of deterrence. The debate of Russia's concept of deterrence is lively. It has been approached as a broad concept, there is talk of strategic deterrence, in which case it is seen as a comprehensive policy of the state and a diversity of means. Also, a narrower perspective is topical, focusing largely on the role of military force in forming a deterrent. Both approaches are needed, and I hope that some answers to these questions will be found. I encourage the constructive commenting and challenging speakers. It is excellent that the program highlights the historical perspective of Russia's thought. This is all more important given that the trend of recent years is leading to the fact that armament control regimes are perhaps becoming outdated. The question of the elements of deterrence and the factors related to it are essential for all of us. Here, of course, military technology developments bring their own growing challenges. Our Russia research group has worked hard to make this seminar possible. I thank the organizers and especially I thank everyone who has taken their precious time to attend this seminar. I wish everyone a rewarding and informative seminar, and I hope for a lively discussion. With these remarks, wishing you a fruitful debate, I declare Russia seminar open. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Pentti Forsström, and it gives me a pleasure to invite our first keynote speaker from Norway. She's Dr. Kristin Ven Brusgaard, who is acting assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at University of Oslo, where she's a part of the Oslo nuclear project. Previously, she was a nuclear security postdoctoral and pre-doctoral fellow at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University, and before that, a research fellow at the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies and a defense analyst in the Norwegian Armed Forces. Her research covers Russian nuclear strategy, military doctrine, deterrence and crisis stability in Europe. Her publications include Russian nuclear strategy and conventional inferiority in Journal of Strategic Studies. Russia killed arms control. Why does it want to keep the New START? In Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. The myth of Russia's lowered nuclear threshold in War on the Rocks and Russian strategic deterrence in survival. Dr. Ven Brusgaard, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to start my video, but I think that Elise has to change some setting for me to be able to start my video. But let me start by thanking the Finnish National Defense University for this invitation and the opportunity to be with you this morning from Oslo. Hold on, now I should be able to, here we go.
Yeah.
All right, great. I'm very honored to be able to set the stage for what promises to be a very fascinating discussion over several days on Russian deterrence theory and practice. So in these introductory remarks, I will talk about the Russian concept of strategic deterrence and how it affects European security. I will first talk about the adaptation of the concept of deterrence in the Russian vernacular and how it became an organizing principle for Russian defense and state security policy across the conflict spectrum, from peacetime through crisis and to war. I will then say a bit about how Russian theorists debate how to make use of the range of capabilities that are now available to the Russian leadership across these periods. So across peacetime, increased tension and war. And finally, and to conclude, I'll discuss the implications of this unique Russian deterrence concept for European security. So first, on the concept of deterrence in the Russian context. The concept of deterrence, of course, being about influencing the intentions of an adversary. Since the dawn of nuclear weapons, deterrence has become tightly associated with nuclear deterrence. Theories and deliberations about deterrence strategy as we know it was heavily influenced by Western and primarily US strategists who debated the implications of the nuclear revolution on state security policy and on international relations in the 1950s, 60s, and onwards. In the Russian context, the term deterrence was employed as an organizing principle for state policy only after the end of the Cold War. Before this, and during the Soviet period, the deterrent term was associated primarily with describing Western policy. The Soviet term that could be compared was war prevention, and this was a concept that entailed a relatively clear distribution of labor, as far as I understand, where the Soviet political leadership was responsible for creating the political conditions to prevent war, whereas the military leadership and the Soviet military was responsible for creating the optimal conditions for prevailing in war in case deterrence failed or war was not prevented. This was a different notion than with the Western deterrent policy, which was a military policy aimed at achieving both the political and military goal of deterrence. But from the early 1990s and onwards, we see that Russian military strategists start adapting the term deterrence. For the first time, the 1993 main provisions of the military doctrine of the Russian Federation actually used the term deterrence to describe what was the main purpose of Russian nuclear weapons policy. So the 1993 Russian military doctrine says that the purpose of Russian nuclear weapons policy is to eliminate the danger of war by deterring aggression. At this point in the early 1990s, Russian theorists and strategists were debating the implications of the reduced capacity of the Russian general purpose forces amid the increasing significance of conventional weapons. The first Gulf War had demonstrated the dawn of the revolution in military affairs that Soviet strategists had been theorizing about since the 1980s. As a result of this technological progress of Western militaries, Russian military planners started debating the implications of particularly conventional precision strike capabilities for their nuclear retaliatory capability. They became concerned that conventional counterforce capabilities could, with time, constitute a significant threat to Russia's deterrent potential. From this point onwards, Russia started explicitly promising nuclear retaliation in the face of large-scale conventional aggression. That is, Russia started explicitly promising nuclear first use as opposed to the Soviet declaratory policy of no first use, which of course was controversial. So this, in the early 1990s, was the starting point of an intense and sustained debate in Russian military and security policy circles that spans across several decades and that is about the requirements of deterrence. It would entail not only debates on what types of capabilities would be necessary to influence the calculations of an adversary, but it would also be a debate about what types of threats could be deterred by way of such capabilities. So in the early 1990s, Russian strategists deemed Russian conventional forces as insufficient to influence the conventional intentions of an adversary. And this concern only intensified further because of the 1999 Kosovo bombing. That NATO operation demonstrated two things to the Russian security policy elite. First, that Western conventional precision strike munitions and their means of delivery were improving fast and that the Russians were severely lagging. And second, that NATO, the alliance, was willing to make use of this strategic tool without a UN Security Council mandate and to unseat regimes that they took a dislike to. This political development was perhaps as concerning in Moscow excuse me, as the military technological one. The idea that the NATO alliance would one day wake up and think about a conventional bombing assault on Moscow produced a significant strategic problem for the Russians. Russian military planners thus never lived through the period of rosy relations that many Western countries entertained. In the West, the problems of deterrence and nuclear deterrence in particular hit the back burner in the 1990s and the early 2000s, when security policy debates were fully reoriented toward counterinsurgency and capacity building. The Russians were, of course, dealing with these types of challenges as well, as we all know, but the strategic challenge of deterring conventionally superior adversary never receded from the minds of the Russian general staff. From around 2005 onwards, we see a gradual emergence of a more complex strategic deterrence concept that includes also non-nuclear deterrence. Many Russian theorists and leaders were debating and were uncomfortable with an increased emphasis on early nuclear use in conflict. They deemed that nuclear threats were not credible to deter the increasingly complex and non-conventional threats that Russia could be facing in the future, such as, for example, the threat of color revolution or the threat of smaller scale conventional aggression. Additional capabilities were needed to credibly deter the range of threats, the broad range of threats that Russia was facing. And with the expansion of tools and capabilities that could serve to influence a potential adversary, strategic deterrence gradually became an organizing principle for state defense policy, also beyond the nuclear realm. It has affected, in turn, the quality and the quantity of conventional capabilities that are being pursued as Russia modernizes its armed forces. And it serves also to make sense of, and as an organizing principle for how Russia makes use of non-nuclear and non-military tools of influence against potential military adversaries. So what is the Russian concept of strategic deterrence today? Today, strategic deterrence is defined in the official Russian military encyclopedia that's published on the Russian Ministry of Defense website as a system of forceful and non-forceful measures carried out in a consistent way by one state to restrain another from any possible coercive actions that would inflict strategic damage on the first state. Furthermore, the definition states that strategic deterrence should be carried out continuously, that is, in both peacetime and war, and not only for preventing coercive actions, but also for keeping the target state contained and for preventing the escalation or for the de-escalation of military conflict. In other words, this is a system of measures, both military and non-military, that should deter, restrain, and influence potential adversaries across the conflict continuum, from peacetime through periods of increased tension and to wartime. This Russian term thus means something different from what we in the West traditionally mean when we use the word deterrence. We use this word to describe the prevention or avoidance of conflict. It works until it fails and conflict breaks out. Russian theorists mean this as well as the application of military or non-military force or other use of forceful measures to also influence the course of conflict and to influence war outcomes. In the West, we use the term intra-war deterrence or restoration of deterrence to talk about the prevention of nuclear escalation in a conflict. In the Russian context, they talk about employing nuclear weapons as a means of deterrence. So there is a significant difference in our vocabulary. Today, the Russian strategic deterrence concept involves the range of capabilities that the Russian state has at its disposal to influence how adversaries think of the costs associated with confronting Russia or with a conflict with Russia. It includes, of course, Russia's nuclear capabilities as a key backbone for any credible deterrent. It includes conventional capabilities such as precision strike capabilities, air and missile defense capabilities. It includes non-conventional capabilities such as cyber capabilities and the range of tools for information confrontation, as well as novel and emerging technologies. And it also includes the range of other tools that are available to the Russian state and that can serve to influence its environment, including diplomatic tools, economic tools, informational tools, ideological tools, and scientific tools. This is, again, according to the definition of strategic deterrence. The Russian strategic deterrence concept has now evolved to capitalize on the relationship between these different types of capabilities. And most thoroughly theorized, at least in military periodicals, is perhaps this relationship between nuclear and non-nuclear deterrence, where one foundational idea is that the credibility of nuclear deterrence increases with the expansion of conventional deterrent capabilities. In turn, those expanded conventional options for dealing with a range of crises rest on a fundament or basis of nuclear deterrence, without which there would be no deterrent effect. And the conventional capabilities in turn make more credible the threat to ultimately make use of nuclear weapons in crises of or conflict that are so severe that they threaten the very existence of the Russian state. So how does Russia make use of these capabilities to influence potential or actual adversaries? They do so, as we heard, with continuous deterrent activity across the peace, crisis, and war continuum. I'll talk about each of these categories or stages. In peacetime, the official purpose of strategic deterrent action is to prevent aggression and prevent threats against peace, as well as threats against the vital interests of Russia from emerging. In this context, we can talk about the different but also overlapping tasks of the different capabilities that Russia makes use of. That is nuclear weapons, conventional weapons, and non-conventional capabilities that are part of the strategic deterrence concept. Nuclear weapons, if we start with those, of course, serve to deter nuclear aggression against Russia, also in peacetime. And we see that a number of the new strategic capabilities that Russia is pursuing is with the explicit purpose of ensuring Russian secure second strike capability. Examples of this are the Avangard, the Status 6, and the Burevestnik. These capabilities all contribute to a Russian capacity to survive any potential first strike and to a capacity to overcome any missile defense hurdles that may stand in the way of effecting a retaliatory strike. Russian nuclear weapons also serve to deter large-scale conventional aggression. Russia still believes that it could be vulnerable to the superior conventional technology of an adversary, such as the West and such as NATO, and still promises nuclear first use in the event of such large-scale aggression that threatens the existence of the state. Now, non-nuclear deterrent means including conventional military capabilities also serve to influence an adversary, according to Russian military theorists. They demonstrate that is conventional deterrent means demonstrate the potential costs of smaller scale conventional aggression or the costs of non-conventional aggression against Russia to an adversary. And Russia uses a range of means for conveying this, including the demonstration of military presence and force, but also including intelligence information activities, measures to ensure its economic security, and the like. And Russia also makes use of non-coercive means such as political, diplomatic, legal, economic, ideological, and informational means to prevent the development or to prevent the escalation of conflict. We see many examples of this Russian use of non-nuclear deterrent capabilities to influence its environment in peacetime these days. At least, I think it's fair to say that most European countries' perception of the costs associated with a conflict with Russia has changed in recent years because of the types of Russian actions that we have seen across the European continent as well as in the United States. So what about in periods of increased tension? In a crisis or in a period of increased tension, and given the range of capabilities and tools that Russia makes use of in peacetime to influence potential adversaries, it seems obvious that an increase in hostilities or a crisis will produce an intensification of these Russian efforts across the spectrum of capabilities. We already see in peacetime, if we call the current period peacetime, this active demonstration of Russian military capabilities. The level of military activity that we see may be an indication that this is not for them a peaceful period, but rather one of increased hostilities. This is a term, of course, that they use actively about the transition between peace and war. That is not to say that a transition to war is inevitable, but that several of the traits of the current situation may, to some Russian observers at least, resemble that of a period of increased tension. The Russian deterrence concept also demonstrates another important clarification. Peace and war have not become the same in Russian doctrine, as some suggest. It is rather that there is a perceived dynamic to the international environment where distinguishing the one from the other may become more complicated, as all actors make use of a broader range of tools to influence the adversary. The perceived intensity of conflict impacts the tools that are used, and it's necessary to say as well that Russian theorists also observe this kind of, or believe that they observe this kind of behavior from Western actors, such as from the United States. In periods of increased tension, Russia makes use of non-conventional capabilities to shape the information environment and to signal coercive capability. Depending on the severity of the crisis, Russia could carry out coercive but perhaps non-military action. We have, of course, seen several examples of the range of cyber activities or cyber attacks that Russia has carried out across the European continent and across the United States, including a relatively large-scale one against Norway this fall. Also, depending on the severity of the crisis or the increased tension and Russia's stakes in it, a range of measures could be used to produce either non-kinetic or kinetic coercive effect on an adversary. And this in turn would move us across what we would traditionally term a threshold to conflict or war. So in war, the purpose of Russian strategic deterrence is, and again, I quote from this definition of strategic deterrence, the purpose of strategic deterrence in war is to prevent escalation or the de-escalation or the rapid termination of conflict on terms acceptable to Russia before the massive use of nuclear or other weapons of mass destruction and before the eruption of large-scale war. In such conditions, official Russian documents also spell out the range of activities that are available to Russia for influencing an adversary, including, of course, the range of military options that are available, including, or these are some examples of what are being mentioned: moving troops from a peace to a war footing, threatening to carry out or actually carrying out limited military strikes with either conventional capabilities or with nuclear capabilities. Nuclear weapons, of course, being the ultimate tool for inflicting unacceptable damage on an adversary. Their employment would demonstrate a Russian willingness to escalate and to incur the costs of risking further escalation. It would not convey a Russian confidence that employing nuclear weapons or introducing them in conflict would not be risky and would not risk further escalation. Rather, it would convey a willingness to sustain that risk and to be willing to take escalation to the next level. But these days, conventional weapons can also, according to Russian theorists, inflict unacceptable damage on a potential adversary. Russian theorists talk about the vulnerability of technologically advanced societies to severe disruption of a scale that might as easily be caused by conventional or non-conventional tools as by nuclear ones. And they also theorize about potential targets for such disruption, including non-populated targets, economic targets, industrial targets, as well as obviously military targets. So what is the effect of this Russian deterrence concept and the range of Russian deterrent actions that we can currently observe? Deterrence as behavior is intended to impact an adversary, meaning that how the adversary interprets this behavior must be intrinsic to the concept. Deterrence should be, ideally at least, responsive to the reaction of the adversary. And this Russian deterrence concept seeks to influence an adversary across the peace, conflict, war continuum to prevent the emergence of armed conflict. Yet one could argue that Russian deterrent behavior in recent years has produced precisely the opposite type of behavior to what Russia seeks. For example, Russia warned against the concentration of foreign troops on its borders since before 2010, when no one was really talking about it, at least in NATO circles, and everyone were surprised that this was an issue that came up in the 2010 Russian military doctrine. And yet, because of Russia's operation in Ukraine in 2014, that was designed to prevent the approximation of Ukraine to Western institutions such as NATO, and enhanced NATO presence on its border was precisely what Russia got. Russia also warned against its encirclement and yet is now facing the intensification of NATO presence and activity along its entire periphery, perhaps bar in its eastern strategic direction. So the question becomes then whether Russian deterrent action is having the intended effect. On the one hand, one could argue yes, to the effect that European countries certainly have a changed perception of the costs associated with the war against Russia now as compared to 10 years ago. Russian military and non-military actions in recent years have, to say the least, made an impression on a Western policy audience. From the nuclear systems that Putin launched in his 2018 State of the Union speech to the tactics that they have employed that move below the threshold of armed conflict, and to the meddling in the political processes of other countries. On the other hand, Russian actions could also be said to trigger a severe security dilemma in Europe, producing this significant strengthening of deterrence and defense postures across countries who are facing a potential threat from a resurgent Russia. This pertains to NATO as an alliance, as well as several other European countries. So Russian deterrent action in peacetime are seemingly not producing precisely the intended outcome. These days, one could speculate about whether there are indications that Russia is seeking to rectify or adjust its deterrent posture, although military signaling activity remains at high levels, if one is to believe NATO press releases about the numbers of sorties that they have carried out in recent years. There is still a change in the, or a seeming change in the nuclear signaling in Russian strategic exercises. Some evidence, for example, of restraint in the Zapad 2017 exercise, the publication of the new nuclear deterrence strategy in the summer of 2020, which could be seen as a transparency measure to dampen Western debates or to clarify or rectify Western misunderstandings regarding Russian nuclear doctrine, although I'm not sure this document resolved all of those debates. The suggested moratorium that Putin has repeatedly talked about on the deployment of intermediate range missiles in Europe could also be pitched in this light if one were to give the Russians the benefit of the doubt. And one could also so there are some indications, at least, that Russia is somewhat modifying some of its behavior, and that it is aware of the security dilemma that some of its actions are causing. Furthermore, one could question what outcomes the Russian strategic deterrent action in war would produce. The concept is one for gradually increasing the pressure on an adversary across domains, presuming that this complex coercive language should be legible to an adversary. The use of non-conventional coercive tools, as Russian theorists speculate about, remains largely untested. So Russian theorists are simply hypothesizing about how advanced societies would succumb to economic pressure, for example. Furthermore, the integrated concept of gradually increasing the pressure on an adversary with dual capable systems is also potentially risky or even fatally flawed. The idea that an adversary should know and understand that a non-nuclear strike on some vital or less vital target is a warning or effort at coercion rather than the onset of a larger conventional campaign is assuming a lot amid the fog of war. Furthermore, the assumption that the adversary will understand that what comes next will be nuclear is also presumptuous and or could backfire through inadvertent escalation or through enraging an adversary and through then triggering certain escalation. So to conclude, the Russian strategic deterrence concept is one unlike Western concepts of deterrence that depict the prevention of war. This Russian concept of strategic deterrence is a much broader concept that can be termed a guiding principle for Russian conduct, both in peacetime, through periods of increased tension, and in war. It's their key idea of how an adversary may submit to Russian demands. The Russian concept entails what we in the West traditionally understand as both deterrence, coercion, and outright war. The Russian strategic deterrence concept raises several questions regarding the use and application of military force and other state tools of power to influence potential adversaries. It assumes a fair bit about how an adversary should understand Russian signals and red lines, and that an adversary should understand it in other ways than outright aggression. We already see that Russian actions are not being interpreted in this way, at least in the current period. The general notion across Europe is that Russia is now engaged in an unprecedented level of military aggression and reckless activities that endanger peace and security. Most observers are not interpreting this as actions designed to preserve that peace and security, or as actions that are designed to stabilize the military political situation, as Russian theorists would describe it. The Russian strategic deterrence concept entails some good news, but mostly bad news. The good news is, and I quote Dima Adamski, that it is a concept that's intended to contain and manage threats. It's not a concept that's oriented toward destroying societies. The bad news is that it displays how a broad range of tools will be used for coercing any potential adversary of Russia, and that their application will be intensified as the conflict becomes more acute. It demonstrates the range of potential targets in the state or alliance that comes into conflict with Russia, where Russia will target its state functions, its economic capacity, its social and political cohesion, as well as its military capability. The latter will not necessarily be the first or even the primary target. The primary target will be the political decision to sustain the fight against Russia and to keep resisting. And Russia's range of tools to influence those decisions are growing. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the debate that is ahead of us.
Okay, now we go. Oh, thank you, Kristin. It was a very thorough and informative through all the history of the new Russia. Thank you for that. And I think we have a few minutes time for some questions, and there is one from Moscow Center of Analysis of Strategies and Technologies. Maxim Shepovalenko asks, Christine, could you please dwell upon the defense sufficiency concept which underlies the Russian deterrence model as per the Russian military strategist? That was the question about the sufficiency concept for defense.
Yes, should I answer right away?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so to be honest, I have not seen detailed debates about the requirements for defense sufficiently in recent years, but this is perhaps a topic that I should investigate in greater detail. So my insights into this would stem from those debates on defense sufficiency that stemmed from the latter period of the Soviet Union, when this was a very, very active debate regarding basically the requirements of deterrence and whether strategic nuclear forces could be reduced significantly to provide for a much smaller force, and that would suffice in order to deter potential adversaries. As far as I am aware, I haven't seen sort of the revitalization of that debate. But it may be that it has been revitalized and that I'm not aware of it, and I would be happy for the person who asked the question as well. Oh, okay, great. Yeah, I see in the chat here that this was an issue that came up now in a recent issue of Voennoye Mysl, which is very interesting, because this debate that took place in the 1980s was quite heated, I think, and involved a lot of different actors as well, both from the civilian side and from the military side, and where it produced a quite intense debate on how, among military theorists, among how to calculate what would be required from a defense efficiency standpoint. So I'd be very interested to see the revitalization of that debate and what the consequences would be for the Russian, or the potential consequences for the Russian force posture.
Thank you. Thank you. And if I may add to that, this debate in the 80s was linked with the debate on what type of war the Soviet Union was preparing for. And this, in a way, leads us to a second question that is at the chat from Professor Hanna Ojanen. She's asking about definition of peacetime that would have relevance today, and what could be widely shared. I was also thinking while you were mentioning that there's increasing understanding among the Russian writers that we are in transition to increased tension. So I would like to ask, first of all, Hanna's question about the definition of peacetime, but also how widely it is shared, this idea that we are in an increased tension among the Russian writers. Thanks.
Yeah, no, so thank you very much for the question. And to clarify, I'm not saying that a lot of Russian theorists are explicitly stating, at least not as far as I've seen, that we are now in a period of increased tension, but I would surmise that if you observe the types of tools that are being made use of now by the Russians across the range of tools that they have available, one could speculate about whether this type of activity that we see from the Russian side pertains to the type of activity that they they perceive should be part of what they define as a peaceful period, or whether the level of activity that we're currently seeing in fact indicates that we are moving up this sort of spectrum or continuum of conflict as they define it. I haven't seen any detailed definitions of the term peacetime. I've just seen them using those terms: peace, periods of increased tension, and conflict or war. But I haven't sort of question the term either of how precisely to define peacetime, but it's certainly one where they theorize about how the application of or the use of several of these capabilities and methods is also applicable even in peacetime. So I think that your questions raise this issue of the difficulty of determining precisely in this conflict continuum where we may be.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure we will come back to these definitions many times during this seminar. So thank you very much for Dr. Brusgaard for opening our seminar with such a excellent speech. And since there are no more kind of quick questions, I think we will go forward with our program, and we'll have a discussion in the end of the first session where we have two speakers, Pentti Forsström and Stefan de Spiegeleyre. And let me first introduce my colleague, Pentti Forsström. He's a member of Russia Group and a senior researcher at the National Defense University. He has a General Staff Officer's degree from the year 1997 and has served in the Finnish Defense Forces until 2017. Forsström's military experience includes several positions in military intelligence and strategic research and 5 years abroad. In 2009, he graduated from the General Staff Academy of the Russian Armed Forces. And during the last 2 years in active military service, he finalized his doctoral dissertation on the development of Russian military strategy. In 2019, he was appointed as a senior researcher in the Russian Art of War team. And his current research interest focuses on Russian military in general and the art of war. So, floor is yours, Pentti.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm a bit afraid that I will repeat the wordings and sayings what Dr. Brusgaard said. But anyway, the repetition is one way of learning, I think. I will concentrate mainly to the concept of deterrence from the structural point of view. How has it developed during the years after the collapse of the Soviet Union? As was mentioned, that and also I will give some very short extracts from the different scholars which have been saying, not them all as was mentioned by Dr. Brusgaard, and give a bit more, let's say, practical military conclusions afterwards in the end of the presentation. So the Russian concept of prevention of war is multidimensional and a hyponym which consists of political, juridical, economic and military means and acts of solving emerging disputes. The prevention can be divided into actions using military, that means based on armed power or military power, or non-military means. Despite the fact that one of the goals for Russian military policy is creating favorable conditions in a specific area, in this presentation, I don't examine those non-military power actions. I will concentrate on the development of the Russian concept of deterrence from the structural point of view, and furthermore, I focus it on deterrence based on the military power. In Russia, the discussion and debate on prevention of military conflict was rather slight in the end of the 90s and even in the beginning of 2000. Neither had Russia a comprehensive concept in this regard, as we saw from the Northern Caucasus situation in the end of 19. One reason for this was that the basic starting point was the confidence or on undisputed sufficiency of the nuclear weapons arsenal. The argument was that these weapons prevented the military coalition between the Soviet Union and NATO. Another factor was that the radical decline of Russia's conventional military capabilities, which was compensated by inevitable relying on the nuclear deterrence in protecting the military security. But these capabilities did not help in preventing the wars in Northern Caucasus in the middle of the 90s and onwards. Third proclaimed factor includes the enlargement of NATO and the cessation of the ABM Treaty in the beginning of 2000, which changed the military strategic situation totally in Europe, at least. In this new situation, there were some suggestions how to safeguard Russian military security. For example, Russia should include in its operational planning the principle of the first use of nuclear weapons in early phases of a possible military conflict and the possibility of limited use of nuclear weapons in the specific theater of war. The military strategic asymmetry, the changes in arms control agreements and in the military political situation and the breakout of internal armed conflicts initiated the reconsideration of the function of the nuclear weapon and its conclusions. For example, Andrei Kokosin wrote in 1999 that, I quote, the nuclear deterrence is not a medicine for protecting the national security, nor can it control or neutralize the whole spectrum of military threats. Furthermore, with nuclear potential, one cannot compensate the economic or political weaknesses of a state. Another example from the military, General Ruksin, who was serving as the first deputy of the chief of the main operational directorate in General Staff, wrote in 2000 concerning the goals of the deterrence as follows. I quote, the adversary must be convinced not only of the fact that Russia does have adequate nuclear potential and determination to use it if the national security is threatened, but also the understanding that the use of it will be effective. According to Ruksin, the role of the nuclear weapon was changing in protecting the national security, and the forms and means to use it were developing. Furthermore, there was a trend of transition towards the limited use of nuclear weapon and increase of proportional role of non-strategic nuclear weapons in the light of reduction of the strategic nuclear arsenal. It has to be said that at those times in Russia, a comprehensive revision of military planning was underway what comes to the military planning and relations between the conventional and nuclear weapons. I think the absence of results from the scientific research and especially the absence of the official decisions resulted in varying use of the wordings. For example, in the early 2000s, the president of the Academy of Military Sciences, Mahmoud Kareyev, wrote about prevention, delimitation, neutralization of threats, but not specifically about terms of deterrence or strategic deterrence. The concept of prevention of war or military conflict was often equal to deterrence by strategic nuclear weapons and often the concept of strategic deterrence, when it was used, was equal to nuclear deterrence, and so on. The theoretical definitions was made after the theoretical grounds or the concept of practical use of military power. I think this was quite turbulence in what was gradually diminishing towards the year 2010. Also, the new concept afterwards has been introduced. For example, in the military doctrine of 2014 was mentioned the non-nuclear deterrence. Then a few words about the nuclear deterrence. The basic idea, again, which was mentioned by Professor Van Broeskaart, the idea of the concept is that Russia sees that the military conflict can escalate to a large-scale war with nuclear weapons. Therefore, the nuclear forces are one of the main cause of the military policy. That is the worst possible case for planning. By definition, nuclear deterrence is a system based on the use of military force meant to deter a possible aggression. It requires combat readiness of the forces and is conducted during the peace and war all the way till the possible massive use of nuclear weapons in a large-scale war. Nevertheless, the principle of deterrence by punishment and the principle of de-escalation with nuclear weapons is mutually contradictory by nature. Taken into consideration of the function of the deterrence, the contradiction is understandable. For the essential point in deterring is that it's covered with uncertainty and ambivalence. Russia has the purpose to indicate that the de-escalation is possible by using tactical or operational tactical nuclear weapons. Defense Minister Sergei Ivanov implied this in 2005 that Russia might consider a warning strike with nuclear weapons to be included to the definition of deterrence. So Russia has a two-level nuclear deterrence until recently, consisting of strategic weapons on global level and tactical weapons on regional and local level. This is because of the INF Treaty ordered to destroy the nuclear weapons systems on the operational level. This formed a black hole in the capabilities and in the hierarchy of the art of war. One solution to this shortage in Russia's deterrence was suggested again by Andrei Kokosin, who was saying that it could be compensated by selective use of nuclear weapons with limited power. However, this problem, if it can be called a problem, was officially solved when the INF Treaty ceased to exist 2 years ago. It was obvious that, for example, the Iskander family missiles will fill the hole mentioned in the Russian deterrence system, both with the conventional and with the nuclear capabilities. After this, the Russian deterrence is based on the threat to use nuclear weapons in tactical, operational, and strategic level, at least from the land-based platforms. I share one picture to you.
Great.
Näkyy.
Excellent.
Good. So, then about the military political deterrence or the level of according to the Defense Ministry's definition, the military political deterrence is based on the existence of military power and especially on the potential of military power. The military power is defined by the capabilities to cause intolerable damage to the adversary in every circumstances. The use of military power requires firm decisiveness in decision-making to choose the adequate military means of punishment in the case of an aggression. Russia regards also the potential military power as one indirect means of deterrence. With this definition, Russia wants to emphasize not only the unity of the political elite and the military, but also the fact that the potential military power has a function of some sort to be carried out already in the peacetime. It is beyond doubt that the peacetime actions of Russian military force, that is in the indirect and demonstrative show of force, have become a routine over the past years. Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu has carried out the orders of the Supreme Commander and organized the so-called SNAP exercises in different military districts. And again, Russia wants to emphasize the role of the President as an operational commander. From the deterrence point of view, the question relates to the informational effect, the efficiency of the command and control system, as well as to show of decisiveness of the leaders. The question is simply about the credibility of the deterrence and how it is shown to the outside world. Again, it was Andrei Kakoshin who put forward in 2012 the concept of nuclear deterrence, by which he meant exercising deterrence with conventional weapons system. That means in Russian, недъядерные сдерживания. Actually, Kakoshin used the words pre-nuclear deterrence, by which he had in mind the use of so-called new conventional weapons. In this context, the words of peacetime and grey zone time were used. This is not a categorical limitation. According to Kakoshin, the use of long-distance conventional precision weapons would be the last warning before the, for example, of the selective strike with nuclear weapons. This presumably is one key areas of the research and development in the Russian military establishment. One perception is that the deterrence can be exercised also with regional group of forces with conventional weaponry. The shortage in this is that of the perception that they don't have the deterrence effect needed to an adversary, which is having the long-range capabilities in its disposal. Instead of this, it has been identified a growing meaning of rapidly maneuverable troops from the deterrence point of view, especially on the local level. And then the strategic deterrence. The starting point for the concept of strategic deterrence was in the middle of 2005, when General Staff, Military Academy of the General Staff, and the Academy of Military Sciences published their perceptions and views on the concept of strategic deterrence. The main goal for the deterrence policy was the prevention, the aggression towards Russia. And furthermore, it was stated that during peacetime, the goal of the strategic deterrence was to prevent, constrain, and aggression, and in time of war, to de-escalate the attack and termination of hostilities with conditions favorable to Russia. The means for deterrence were causing the fear, and they were meant to be executed in the frames of a single system. This would make it possible to use different means in a flexible and rational way according to the situation. Again, and in these articles, the deterrence was formulated as all-encompassing holistic set of tools for the military political leaders. It would include both political, that means non-military, and means based on the military power during peacetime and during the time of war, until the moment of massive use of nuclear weapons. In this way, the content of this definition was more or less the same as for the military political deterrence. It is worth to notice that already the idea of single system was mentioned, which today we know as the National Center for Managing the Defense in Russia. Afterwards, the Defense Ministry published a more comprehensive definition for the concept of strategic defense. One difference was that strategic deterrence is executed constantly and to keep the object within certain frames. This definition ties together different spheres of policy and directs them to achieve the one and only objective. No matter how clear the definition might be, there is always room for interpretation, which was obviously the original purpose of the writers. Another feature is that it gives Russia the possibility to evaluate subjectively the situation, criteria of which is useless for external factors to look for. The subjectivity, and without any condition, it relates directly to the national sovereignty which Russia frequently emphasizes. The non-specific wordings and incoherence can be considered self-evident from the point of view of the objective of the deterrence. The essence of the deterrence is to influence to the adversary's awareness, to cause the uncertainty and even fear eventually. In this regard, full transparency is not the leading principle of the deterrence concept. The transparency is practical when a demonstration of military force takes place. This was the one phase in the evolution of the concept of deterrence. The tendency is that the set of tools based solely on military power and especially on nuclear weapons is supplemented with additional new elements of multidimensional influence towards a possible adversary. The target object of the deterrence is not only the military political leaders, but also a broader target audience and its consciousness. The military components has a twofold task: to deter and to wage war if necessary, and the borderline between them is rather vague. The timing of deterrence and management and the use of means is more or less proactive. It seems that the use of dual-purpose technology is increasing, which enables the flexible use and the dosing of the destructive power. Then a few words to conclude my presentation. The actions of the 1990s can be summarized that the Russia's focus was on traditional deterrence based on the military power and especially on the nuclear powers and its meaning as a preventive factor. The strategic nuclear weapons played the main role. The time resulted in deep disappointment to the significance of the military power, especially of the potential of the nuclear weapons in preventing war or maintaining the parity on local, regional or global level. The early years after the millennium, the awareness increased and the needs were identified how to develop the prevention and deterrence system. Functionally, a result and the only solution for this problem was found: to emphasize the role of nuclear weapons and their capabilities in practice and in conceptual documents. The reminder of non-strategic nuclear weapons existence did not mean multiplication of the military power. The non-strategic weapons were there from the very beginning. The essence of their role was rather to compensate the shortages concerning the conventional forces. The beginning of concept of development can be traced to the year 2005, after which the conceptual definitions are more clearly structured and simultaneously the content broadened. The essential change was the division of the military powers functions into the deterrence in peacetime on one hand and to the warfare during a possible conflict on the other. The function of deterrence did not apply to conventional forces in the same sense as for the nuclear forces. Approximately from the year 2010 and afterwards, the period was a phase of actual development and practical testing of the concept of strategic deterrence. Many examples can be found on local, regional, and even in the global level. In addition to this, the conventional military power could be included to the deterrence system. The deterrence function of the military power of the conventional forces have been in practice frequently after 2012 in form of SNAP or regular military exercises, for example. The scale of these exercises has never been seen since the collapse of the Soviet Union. To a certain extent, at least in the very beginning, they obviously also took the Russian military by surprise. The factor of surprise depends on the combat readiness of the armed forces. And again, the readiness produces the needed information to maintain the deterrence. The tasks for the conventional forces has been increased as well. As of today, Russia is entering to a phase where new military technologies and capabilities are tested and included to the arsenal and shown to the outside world. Presumably, these capabilities eventually will change the concept and contents of the deterrence. They will be added to the system someday when they are operational. This means that the proportion of the nuclear weapons in forming the deterrence will decrease. What comes to the art of war, the new weapon system will increase the arsenal and broadens the room of choices in different circumstances. From the military point of view, the essence of the strategic deterrence is firstly a function combining different military tools in a broad sense, aimed at one purpose, and secondly, an operational organism orchestrated from the newly established Defense Management Center. The concept of strategic deterrence incorporates various political, diplomatic, and other non-military activities with the military ones. In this respect, it forms a multifunctional set of tools which can and will be used against an object in various combinations to achieve the objective ordered, as the Russian might say, zadaniy usheb. In addition to this, Russia can make the decisions concerning deterrence actions and order based on the subjective assessment and conditions. The military actions are perhaps not the first ones in the sequence. Russia makes the decisions independently when and how to use military deterrence. This is the basis for the principle of strategic surprise. Theoretically, the development of strategic deterrence is about intentionally transforming the military activity structurally into a more complex system by adding more elements into it. The development means that the relative proportion of one element is reducing, and also if one element loses its effect in the system, the proportion of the remaining ones will increase respectively. This system is functioning and its activity coordinated as a military formation in a centralized way and directly to one objective, to safeguard the security of Russian Federation. The nature of Russian word deterrence is a bit misleading. It refers to deter, keep something away, prevent or repel. This might be interpreted as reactive by nature, but this is not the case. The Russian deterrence is in practice preventive and especially pre-active. Thank you. I conclude now.
Thank you, Pentti, for thank you, Pentti, for excellent speech. We have two questions in the chat, and we'll take those first, and then have the second speaker. First of the questions is of in a way asking about the practical meaning of the concept that we will surely discuss in further as well. So there is a question on how do you view the role of more conventional threats in Russian doctrine of deterrence, such as troops in the Kaliningrad region, sandwiched between Baltics and the Poland. So what does the threat of the troops and ballistic missiles in the region play what is their role in the deterring potential of the aggression? And then about this combination of military and politics. So what about the policy that is of military nature but does not factor in the conventional idea of military operations, such as the demilitarization of the Åland Islands? So this kind of two very practical questions, if we can use that word here. And then we have an excellent question from Maxim again, from Moscow. You saw that. So about your diagram that decomposes nuclear deterrence potential into three capabilities: strategic, operational, and tactical. So could you please speculate on the non-nuclear deterrence potential in the same terms: strategic, operational, and tactical?
Okay.
We can also reserve some of these discussions to the later, but if you briefly briefly answer.
Yeah, the first question about the Kaliningrad region and sandwiched between the Baltics and Poland. Of course, the conventional threats what comes to the doctrine of deterrence. I have the meaning that first of all, for the identity of Russian Federation, it's one has to stick to the defense and perceptions what comes to the military security, also in the Kaliningrad region. And again, it's as we have seen during the last years that Russia would like to how to say expand or enlarge the sphere of influence, and the Kaliningrad region was already there from the very beginning. That means after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and afterwards the region has been intensified with military capabilities as a total. And of course, how the Russia let's say operates with the Kaliningrad question is that it can be, it's more or less like a thermometer of the relations between the West and Russia. But again, it's from the very pure military point of view, it's a crucial area for Russian defense and Russian deterrence and strategy. Can we leave it?
Yeah. We'll come back to the Maxim's question after the second speaker in the panel. So let me now introduce Steven de Spiegelere, with whom I was in a project years ago, and it's very happy to have you speaking today here in our seminar. Steven has worked as a defense and security analyst at the RAND Corporation for nearly 10 years. And since 2004, he has been working in the Netherlands, currently as a principal scientist at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies and a senior advisor defense and security at the Netherlands Organization for Applied Scientific Research. Steven also teaches at the Webster University and lectures at the military academies across the world. He's a non-resident scholar at the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies. His main research area is international defense and security planning with specific focus on strategic foresight. So please, floor is yours. Okay, so now it's on. Now you are on.
Okay, can you hear me too?
Yes.
Yes.
And somebody has stopped my video, which is not that critical, I guess, but if you can restore it, that'd be great. It says the host has stopped it. Yes, thank you. Okay, here we go. All right. Oops, I look all red. Thank you for inviting me, all of you. Whenever we meet at these conferences, we usually do two things, right? We try to share knowledge with each other, knowledge that we've worked on, and then we want to transmit in a meeting. But we often also, and this often happens in the evenings or during the breakout meetings, we reflect on our field and where it stands and how we know what we know. And so my presentation is really focused on this second point. So how do we generate knowledge about Russian deterrence and about deterrence in general? And how confident are we, how comfortable are we with our level of knowledge on these things? And so I've called this presentation Russian Deterrence, We Hardly Know Ye. Some of you may know the expression, we hardly knew ye, which is something that they often say when somebody dies and they look back. Apparently it's an old Irish ballad. But in this case, it's not knew ye, because of course deterrence is very much alive and kicking. So it's an attempt to provide a sort of x-ray of the field and where we stand. And the names you see here are all people that have been working on this. This is part of a larger project that we're doing for the Carnegie Corporation of New York and for the Minerva research program of the United States Defense Department. But of course, the views are entirely ours. There's a couple of German words I really like. Fahrvergnügen, Fingerspitzengefühl. But another one is really interesting, it's Wissensanhäufung, which is this idea that you accumulate knowledge. So what the two presentations have done so far is, they've tried to generate knowledge on their own on this particular field, and they then shared with others in order to accumulate the overall understanding of the topic that we're working on. And what you see on the right is sort of a Catalonian incarnation of this heaping up of knowledge, where people try to stand on each other's shoulders, which some of you may recognize as the motto of Google Scholar, the still largest collection of metadata on scholarly literature, which is also literally standing on the shoulders of giants. Now that sounds great, but how do we actually do that? So let me make two preliminary comments. The first one is that there are really multiple layers of deterrence scholarship. In first instance, we have what we have called deterrence abroad. What you see here is an overview of one of the new data sets that are available, which are open. They're all freely available, freely accessible. You can download hundreds of thousands of records if you want. And they're here categorized by the fields of studies that Microsoft Academic, another really large data set, uses. And so many of you will be familiar with deterrence theory, of course, and you would probably think that international security or political science would be next in line. But as you see, the second largest field is actually biology. Medicine has thought deep and hard about deterrence. Economics, political science only in the 5th spot. And there's lots of other things here. So the crime literature on deterrence is part of the overall deterrence literature. So it's a very large field, as you saw here. There's about 50,000 articles that we've downloaded and that are available on the broader deterrence topic. A part of that is about human deterrence. So it's about how humans try to strategically manipulate fear in order to prevent somebody else from doing something that they don't want. So think about the death penalty in criminology. It's the ultimate deterrence, presumably, to make somebody not commit a crime. Or the pictures of deadly consequences of smoking on cigarette packs. The interesting thing about this particular body of knowledge is that it's very empirical. People have collected large data sets to try to find out, does deterrence work? So it's not just scholastic debates about how do we define deterrence or what are the different things that certain disciplines write about, but it's really an attempt to come to grips with what do we know about deterrence and what does it tell us about the attractiveness of a particular field. Within that field, of course, we have the international security literature on deterrence, which is the one we're all more familiar with. And within that, we have a subsection on Russia. So, of course, all these sizes, all these circles that are on the screen here are purely notional. They do not reflect the actual percentages of articles. But what I'm doing in this presentation is essentially putting this literature in a sort of MRI scanner, where we try to use a couple of different tools, a couple of different approaches to see what we actually know about that literature at this, or at the Wissensanhäufung, the amount of knowledge that has been accumulated on this thing. And so to give you an idea of the size of some of these data sets, and there's a lot of them. I already mentioned Lens because the first slide was based on that, which is about 50,000 articles on the Terrans. There are a number of other ones. So that's the Terrans Broad, which you see in the first top ones there. The next segment of documents is about international security. So for the largest there, of course, Google Scholar, which has a fantastic advantage that it also covers multilingual ones. So if you enter the Terrans, you will also get Ustraszenie or Dissuasion in French. So it's really a fantastic corpus of literature, which has barely been explored. And unfortunately, the bibliometric data sets on the Russian literature are much smaller, or at least they exist, but they're harder to export, and we're still working on that. Let me also already herald that in my next presentation next week, I will tell you more about the substance of what we found on the basis of some of the collections of documents that are out there. So for this particular field, especially Eastview Press has probably the best collection of both academic scholarly articles, most military periodicals, and a variety of other sources where you can just look and collect a data set. So we've collected about 6,000 articles on the Terrans in international security from Eastview Press. There's another data set with Integrum that has some other advantages. It also contains newspapers. So there we've collected a much larger set of documents. And we've also done the same for the English language. Now, let me make one other preliminary remark, which is about precision and recall. And these are terms from the real IR field, which is information retrieval, which is about 4 times bigger than international relations. But they talk about precision and recall. And in order to explain this, let's imagine that you have an entire collection of documents. For instance, Google Scholar, which is used, of course. And you want to write a paper on, say, escalate to de-escalate. Now, you know that within Google Scholar, there will be a subset of relevant documents that you might want to peruse. You will then go out and find a search query, and it would probably start with escalate to de-escalate, and you will get a set of retrieved documents. Precision is the center of this Venn diagram. So the ones that are both relevant and that you have retrieved. Recall is what percentage of all of the retrieved documents that are relevant did you actually find? It is how much is still out there that you have not found. If you know that there are about 3,000 military articles about the Terrans, have we consulted those? I mean, if I were a policymaker or a decision maker, I would want to know that we have done our homework on these things. And I'm not doubting that we have. I'm just questioning whether the tools that we now use to do this are still up to the task. Yeah, let me go over this for time. So one of the things that we wanted to do is to take 3 excellent pieces of widely respected pieces of research. Dima Damski's work, of course, on the Terrans, the CNA, Michael Kaufman, Anja Fink, and others who have done a fantastic piece of work on escalation dominance. And then some of you are probably also familiar with the work of Oskar Jonsson on the Russian Russian understanding of war. Why did we pick those? Because they're very large reference sections. So some of the articles of Dima have, 300 citations. CNA did a fantastic job that they did not only try to collect a corpus, but they even started coding them. And so we wanted to look at what percentage of some of these best examples of writings, Western writings on Russian deterrence, what percentage of what the recall issue is behind that thing. Unfortunately, we found out that when apparently nobody in this field uses bibliographical management programs, so they cannot just share the articles that they've used. So we can only do so much, but that's sort of the idea behind what I'm trying to do here. Let's first of all look a little bit at what's out there. So on the top here, you see that the number of articles that have been published on deterrence in international security. So not just Russia, but overall. And so you see that there have never been as many articles published in the past 10 years or so. And of course, that doesn't reflect the increased salience of that topic. It just reflects that there's a lot more publication venues out there where people are publishing. But if we look at the salience, that is what percentage of the overall scholarly attention is focused on the international deterrence in the international security realm, then you see that the amount of overall attention is actually fairly low and was never higher than the late Cold War and post-Cold War eras. And it's again relatively low. If we just look at deterrence on international security on Russia, which is a data set that we created out of Google Scholar by looking at all the articles that we have on international security and then taking out the ones that have the word Russia, at least in their abstract or title or keywords that the authors have assigned. And here again, you see that recently we cannot calculate the salience because we don't know exactly what the number of articles are in Google Scholar, but we at least know that again in the past, since 2016, so 2014 happened, 2014, the velocity of knowledge production in this field is extremely low. I have some other slides on this, which I didn't put in this presentation. But so it takes a while before we pick up. But so now we produce quite reliably more than 120 articles per year on Russian deterrence. We looked at a few aspects of this literature. The first one is how collaborative is it? Most science progresses by collaboration between scholars. That can take different forms. You can exchange emails, you can meet each other at conferences and have conversations there. All of that is, of course, a form of collaboration. You can cite somebody, which is a very indirect way of collaboration. But the metric that bibliometricians, who are the people who do this for a living, use is basically co-authorship. The real, if you really want to measure the highest level of scientific collaboration, you just look at how many people co-publish articles together. And so here you see in green the average numbers of authors per document per year for the broad deterrence literature, so including medicine and all these other things, and for just international security literature. And you see the huge gap. So even in the deterrence broad literature, it's fairly low. There's only about 3 authors on average per article. In our field, or in the international security field, it is incredibly low, only 1.3 overall. And it is showing very few signs of progress. If you look at the green line is going up. Our line is not going up. What gets worse is if you look at the number of articles with one author, because the average, of course, doesn't show you that. So it turns out that 4/5 of all articles in international security are single authored. And this compares to 50%, and that's why we put in that other corpus, only 50% in the broader deterrence literature are. So there's a huge gap here. What about academic versus non-academic? Well, there's no big difference here. They're both equally uncooperative in many ways. It's just that the non-academic is a bit better than the academic one. How about the literature on Russia, so the English language literature on Russian deterrence? Well, here again, we see that the academic Russian deterrence scholars are a bit worse than the overall group of people who are working in this area. The non-academic ones are a bit better, but the difference is absolutely minuscule. So we're talking about an increasing, a very uncollaborative group of scientists here, which I think, we should question. Are we happy with that? Do you want to continue that? I mean, we've done this work for a couple of different topics now, not just on deterrence. This is the lowest we've ever found. So this is sort of something that we really want to look at. We also looked at think tanks, right? So the 2 main producers of knowledge, also applicable knowledge on deterrence, are the academic world and the more policy applied think tank world. And often people sort of mix between the two, so it's not neatly delineated. But it's not easy to find a data set on that. So we found a sort of reasonably intelligent way by using the top 100 think tanks and then looking at all the URLs that were in the, or the top domain level, the top level domain names that are in the Google Scholar set. And this is sort of what this shows. And again, it shows that think tanks are a little bit better, but not really all that much better on the collaborative aspect. And whether you're talking about international security as a whole or about Russia. International collaboration, what you see here on the slide is 2 different data sets from deterrence, that's the bottom one, where we looked at the affiliations of the authors that are available in the data set. And we did the same thing for the body of scholarly knowledge on COVID-19. And we use that because it's so easily available, those data sets. And you see the difference, right? So our field is not only not very collaborative in terms of how many people work together to produce knowledge, but it is, of course, it hasn't even come close to the explosion of collaborative scholarship on a topic that we investigate because we're afraid people are going to die. We investigate international security for very much the same reason. And yet the intensity of collaborative knowledge building is much lower. The second thing we looked at is how often are these things cited? Because real Wissensanhäufung would presume that, you know, there's a lot of documents, all documents would be cited ideally, at least most documents would be cited, and they would be cited relatively quickly for a long period of time. None of that is the case. You here again see the green is the broad deterrence literature, and the orange is the international security literature. So you see that on average, an article about deterrence in international security is only cited about 4.5 times, which is significantly lower than the one in the broader deterrence. These are all about deterrence, right? And so there's a huge difference here. We also see that in our field, again, hardly or no progress over time, and quite a bit of progress in these other fields. Take a step here. Here again, we look at the number of times that articles are cited. And so we see that 60% of all articles in the field of international security in the non-academic world get cited. 60% never get cited. So there are some implications you can draw from that, right? It could be the laziness of the other authors that just don't think it interesting enough, or don't have the stamina to go and find out these other documents. It could be that a lot of these documents are just not particularly good, and that's why they're not cited. And my point here is we don't know. And it seems to me that we as scholars, and especially also the decision makers who use our knowledge, would want to have a better feeling about this than what these pictures show. This is the same metric for Russia. And so here again, the overall average amounts of citations is 10.4 for academic and 7.8 for non-academic publications. So not a particularly good score on any of that. If you just look at the Russia subset of the international security literature, we see no discernible trend over time. So it's not like as a community, we are starting to cite each other more. That does not seem to be the case. And every value and for every year is still highly influenced by a number of outliers. So I've just singled out a few here. So the highest cited article in the broader international security literature is a John Eikenberry article in Foreign Affairs a long time ago that was cited 819 times. So of course, all of a sudden, you know, the average for that year goes up a lot, but that's mostly because of that one article. This is just on Russia in think tanks. So this is a subset of 61 documents on Russian deterrence that are indexed in Google Scholar, in which we looked at how many times they're being cited. And so think tanks publications get cited about 10 times, which is higher than some of the other ones. But here again, there are huge outliers. For instance, Chris Chivez's piece on hybrid warfare got cited 125 times. And so that pulls up the average. So not a particularly impressive picture. The third thing we looked at were how many references are in there. So the citations are who cites your article. References is how many references are in your document. So how many footnotes do you have? How many items do you have in your bibliography? And on this particular one, our field looks a little bit more comparable to the broader deterrence field, as you see here. So there's still a 25% difference in the sense that our documents have about a quarter fewer references than the broader deterrence literature does, but at least it's still something that's comparable. The question still remains, of course, what does this mean in terms of recall? So even if Dima Adamski has 2 articles of more than 300 articles in 2014, and Dima is unbelievable, right? I mean, he is a guy who will sit down and read Vojna Mysl from cover to back, and some other periodicals. So he's a rarity in this field. And he, of course, has read more than the 300 that he cites. But how do we know how that relates to the overall, remember the recall issue, right? The overall amount of useful articles that are out there, or relevant articles that he may not have consulted. And so these are questions I think that we as a discipline really should start asking ourselves a lot more. So this is Russia, Russian deterrence studies. And here you see Dima Adamski in 2014, of course, jumping out with an article that's 293 articles. So there is probably a recall issue. I'll go very quickly over this one. What you see here is the degree of installation of our field. So on the left side, you see the articles that are citing. On the right side, you see the articles that are cited. And they are both clustered by discipline. So the blue ones you see, I don't see where you see my cursor, but the sort of turquoise lines that you see on the bottom are the ones that go from our field, say political science, international relations, to the other field. As you see, the other disciplines on the Terence go and tap into a lot more different literatures than we tend to do. So in terms of insularity of our field, it's quite high. The final metric I want to show you is entropy, which is a term that, again, the information retrieval discipline uses to measure, you could either call it uncertainty. So does a field all of a sudden become much less certain about what it knows about a certain topic because it is starting to use new terms, different concepts? Or the other way to look at it is to think about it in terms of novelty, innovation. And so we see that both the English literature and the Russian literature, English in blue, Russian in orange, have seen quite a marked increase in innovation, and not just since 2014, but even before that, since the sort of teens. And we also see that the Russian literature here seems to be a little bit less innovative in this sense than the English one, and it seems to be running a little bit behind. Of course, this is a very quick analysis, and we're still looking deeper into the data to find out more about this. But what are my main takeaways? We know that the Terence plays an increasingly important role in our defense postures, a role that is exorbitantly expensive, right? I mean, we don't often, we are now, next week I'll show you some things about that, the ridiculously small amount of articles that actually talks about the cost of the Terence, and not just financial costs, but also some other reputational, dynamic costs that come with the Terence. So it's a costly course of action, or a ways. I mean, if you think about ends, ways, and means, the Terence is a way in which you can achieve the objectives that you want to achieve. And it's an expensive one. And so if you look at the role it plays, you would assume that you would know it deserves, and you would assume that it receives all the analytical rigor and creativity that's out there. Our MRI scan of the literature actually shows the opposite. And I certainly find these results quite worrisome. The field is, in comparison to other fields, extremely uncollaborative. 80% of the articles are single authored, which means that somebody really does go back into their rooms and reads a bunch of articles and tries to make sense of it in their brain. Then they publish something, usually a year later, year and a half later. They get cited for the first time. If they get cited at all, and most don't, they get cited quite a bit later. So it's really a quite uncollaborative field. There's a disturbingly high amount of publications, I think this 20% is wrong, that never even get cited. And as I mentioned, there are multiple explanations for this, but none of them bode well for our field. And finally, we almost certainly have a recall problem. There used to be a time when recall was unachievable because the stuff was not available. There essentially today are no more excuses not to try to look in the broader array of literature that's out there and to start using some tools. And today I've showed you some bibliometric tools. Next week, I'll show you some natural language processing tools that allow us to make sense of the things that we're all struggling with. Not to have machines replace us, but to have have machines help us to make sense of this literature. And this is where the good news lies, because there does seem to be light at the end of the tunnel. The new data sets, and I've showed you some bibliometric data sets, but we're also building some new data sets on the empirics of the Terence. And so these tools are coming online. Machines' ability, this is one of the most explosive fields of scientific breakthroughs, even just in the past 2 years. And that's in artificial intelligence, and more specifically in natural language processing, whereby we can now use ever more sophisticated tools with, just like us humans who try to explain things in the context. So we don't just count words. We see words in their context. And we know that the Terence in a certain context may mean something else than the Terence in another context. Well, the new context-aware transformers-based NLP tools actually are starting to help us in that direction. And the final point I want to point out was the project I already mentioned, which we call RuBase. We are willing to share all this stuff with you. I mean, we're learning ourselves. We're documenting what we learn. That's why we got the funding from Carnegie, to lower the barriers to entry for researchers who want to avail themselves of these new data sets that are out there. And bear in mind that texts are also data now. So, and for all of those scholars who are willing to do that, we are willing to give them access to everything we have. Of course, it's not copyrighted. So for the Web of Science and Scopus, we can share, but our Lens data set, our Google Scholar data set are certainly things we can share. The final slide on some recommendations. It seems to me that first of all, our governments and our funding agencies who are funding us, we all get funded somehow. Academics may think they do not get funded for the work that they do, but of course, indirectly they do. It is governments put money into academic institutions for research purposes that then ultimately end up on the, in whatever way, in the researcher that's doing the type of work. And my sense is that they really, just like most of us, do not really have an idea of the problem we have with this field. Think about this, right? I told you about the broader deterrence literature, that there's almost no, in many of those literatures, if you look, for instance, at the evidence in public health, how does deterrence work in public health? And we published a larger paper on that earlier this year at HSS, oh, sorry, late last year, middle last year or so, at HSS. And so we find out that on almost all fields where there are good empirical data sets on whether deterrence works, the evidence is extremely disappointing. Deterrence, we've moved away from deterrence in most of the fields other than international security where we use it. Most developed countries do no longer use the death penalty. There are some exceptions, but overall we don't. Some of the most crass forms of deterrence in other walks of life, on the work floor, in education, in families even, in religion, are no longer used because they're just not thought to be very effective. And the consequences are sometimes worse than whatever positive benefit they have. Our field has been almost entirely analog. And I think our government should be aware of that. So there's an enormous amount of benefit to be had if we started becoming a bit more digital, both in our consumption of literature, in our digestion of literature, in our egestion of what we have digested of the literature in visuals, for instance, which we can then use to try to make human sense of what we see. And so I think they also are not aware that they themselves are actually giving us disincentives to do the kind of stuff that we could do. Most of our research projects are short-term. That is, we don't try to really build cumulative knowledge on everything we know from deterrence. We pick one little thing out of it, and let's say Russian deterrence. We pick one topic out of it. We go and look for some articles or books about it. Again, we try to make sense of that, and that's what we do. And we do not have an incentive to work with others because, you know, if you're an academic, you want to publish or perish, and a single authored article is better than a multi-authored article. Even think tanks, right? If I work for a think tank, if we get money from whatever government in the world wants us to do some work on that, we have no incentive to have somebody else work with us because, you know, we want to use that money to pay our own researchers to do the type of work, even though there may be researchers elsewhere that are more competent on some of these issues. And by the way, may even be they provide better value for money on the whole. So that's for governments, but even for us, I think the real recommendation here that we should start getting our act together on this. We should start becoming more proactive. I mean, I know some people think of themselves as just qualitative people versus these quantitative people who like mathematics. That dichotomy, I think, is no longer applicable. We all want to get it right. And if certain new tools can allow us or give us a better chance to get the real Russian record straight. For next week, I will show you some things about the incredible divergences on definitions of military deterrence or deterrence, security deterrence in both the Russian literature and our literature. So we could take more initiative. We're very quick to blame the others, like governments were stupid for not listening to us when we said Russia's still there, be careful, or they should give us more money. I think, frankly, personally, these are disingenuous signals to send to the communities that are out there. And the smarter one would be to argue that even within current funding levels, if they go up, great, but even if they don't go up, we could provide a lot better value for money than we do right now. And that means starting to build and share data sets. And again, text is data now, to start collaborating more, better, more regularly, more openly, to accelerate our overall production rate and quality. And so it seems to me, and I'll end on this note here, is that we really should start thinking about what COVID-19 has taught us. This was an existential crisis, remains in many ways an existential crisis for a big part of our populations, especially the elderly now, in which data were shared, the genome of the virus was shared in January of last year. It was distributed to all researchers working on this. And you then saw a mixture of competitive and collaborative research entities that really managed to produce actionable knowledge that we are all benefiting from today with the vaccines that are being rolled out in an extraordinarily short period of time. Isn't that something that we could take an example of? And shouldn't we also make more initiative in that direction? Thank you. I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you so much, Stephen. Stephen, this is really interesting and excellent kind of a presentation on the larger issues in the field. I would just a short comment to say that you mentioned that after 2014, more things were written and more things happening, but also I think what is important, and our group is an example of it. So there started to be more cooperation in the field. Now it's maybe some groups within certain research communities within states, but this seminar is an example of our understanding the problem, but maybe not seeing it in as wide way as you have demonstrated.
Well, and frankly, on the collaboration, I mean, we do see a small uptick, but it doesn't even come close to any of the levels that we observe in other disciplines.
Yeah.
And that is still something that should cause us concern or could cause pause.
Yeah, but now we kind of recognize it and we can work on it. And I hope that we will work on it. But there was also another aspect in your presentation. You talked about the empirical data set for actual deterrent behavior. And now we come to the discussion where we started today with the concepts. So how to build this kind of a data set. And now I would like to invite all the panelists into this discussion. So we started with the, Dr. Brusgaard's presentation where she was arguing that Russia's concept of deterrence is about not avoiding the conflict, but shaping the environment in a way that is beneficial for the Russian interest. And I very much agree with this idea. And this clearly creates in a way conceptual difficulty how we understand and define the military aspect, the role of the military deterrence and the role of the non-military deterrence. And Pentti had an excellent graphic on this. And if we see that this is as a system, as meant to be a system, but on the other hand, if you define everything that is shaping the environment as a part of the concept of deterrent, there is no limits to this. So I would invite you to take part in this discussion. We have some specific questions for the speakers, but could you maybe elaborate now, Kristin and Pentti, on the idea of Russian deterrence, the uniqueness of the term being about the shaping the environment in different means?
Yeah, if I could start, is that the shaping the environment is a how to say, very clean wording of the one task which the MOD and the military political deterrence is all about. We have to bear in mind that the Russian military and military deterrence is twofold. One of, let's say, as was mentioned, the good news and the bad news is the same way. And what's about in the middle is that the first how to say, approach to the problem or to the situation is that what can be done without using, let's say, military power or whatsoever, this kind of aggressive means of influence. And so this applies also to the Åland Island questions that the situation as it is, it's a demilitarized zone and by the international agreements, and that's that. And it applies also to the interests of the surrounding area and the states surrounding the Baltic Sea in a way that the situation stays calm in that area. Of course, how about to connect the military aspect of the deterrence in that area is let's say the tricky question, and how to do it and how to save it. But of course, one has to be prepared for the good development of the situation and for the bad and even for the worst situation in that. So the shaping the environment is the first, let's say, the first civilized way of taking care of the interests possible state is having.
Kristin, would you like to comment?
Yes, sure. Thank you very much for very interesting interventions. I've enjoyed listening to both of them. So to address the question, I think that this is a very important point. This notion that the expansion of the deterrence concept in the way that we have seen in the Russian theoretical debate, at least, makes it this sort of limitless concept, which in turn makes it very difficult to observe empirically, because it means that basically you could include all types of state behavior and try to make sense of it through this lens of strategic deterrence. And the way that, and I think it also raises, I mean, at least my investigation of this concept of strategic deterrence and how it evolved also raised a number of questions with regard to sort of what comes first. Is this a concept that is being developed to try and make sense of or to try and systematize some of the behavior that Russia is exposing, or is it the other way around? Is it that the concept comes first and then you see the development of these tools and capabilities? I think that is also a difficult deliberation to, and that it may not be possible even to find a proper answer to. But I think the way that I've approached it, at least, is that the investigation of these theoretical debates on this type of concept, like strategic deterrence, may at least serve to illuminate somewhat the purpose behind some of this this behavior that we see from the Russian side, and then, of course, there are significant limitations with regard to how precisely that knowledge will bring us further in terms of deciphering what precisely Russia's intentions are and in what conditions they will make use of the precise capabilities that they have at their disposal. I would also like to thank Stefan for his intervention. I thought it was extremely interesting, and just this notion that or this demonstration of how little we make use of the broader range of deterrent literature, I think, in our field or in the international security field, and then subsequently in the field of studying Russian deterrence, I think is extremely interesting and something that we should think more about. So I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Can I comment on that too, Katri?
Yes, please.
I mean, just to take Kristen's last point on sort of what comes first, right? And how do we know? I mean, this really would require us to start building much more rigorous, on both sides, right? A more comprehensive parsing of what we know, what has been written, and then also a more comprehensive data set on what Russia is actually doing. Now, some of you may be aware of the event data sets that are out there. So, for instance, there are things like the global database on events, language, and tone, the integrated crisis early warning system of the Pentagon, Phoenix. These are all huge data sets, which sometimes go back to 1979, in which hundreds of millions of events are automatically extracted from newspapers. And so one of the categories of codes is threaten. And of course, not every use of threaten is deterrent. But because they extract source actors, which could be Russia, so from all these data sets, you can select the ones that Russia initiates, that are the codes for threaten, and that are directed at other states. That's already a data set you have now. So what we're doing now, a lot of those data sets are based on rules-based coding. So if the verb threaten or synonyms of threaten are in there, it'll be coded as such. There are no smarter ways of doing these things. So my point is here, it can be done right. So a lot of the both scholastic debates that we're having, how do they define deterrence? What is it? In what fields is deterrence being used? They can be done more rigorously, and they could be matched with empirical evidence to come out there. If I can just quickly pick up on the two other points that were raised in the chat here. The first is, why do we have so many single authored pieces? And I think, the answer is quite obvious. I mean, I already mentioned one of them, right? The incentive structure in academia, where, so yes, so the Dutch Defense Academy just came out with a fantastic volume on deterrence, with a whole bunch of people who contributed to that, including Russian views on deterrence by Dima, Chinese views by Dean on deterrence, right? And so that is sort of the state of where we are now. But most of those things are still single authored. So it's a co-authored volume, but with still individual authors writing these kinds of things. I mean, there are exceptions to it. So there's still, it's the incentive structure basically. And that's why I mentioned the funders, right? If they would knew that they actually give us disincentives to work together, they may want to change our incentive structure to encourage more collaboration. And James' point on slender evidence, and that, we have collaborated with others before, and that's sort of what we do. James, none of what I say here is unique to our field, right? The same that you say also applies to all other fields. And yet their collaboration, their demonstrable collaboration indices are much higher than in this particular field. So of course things are happening. And of course I'm painting, I mean, I took the highest hurdle here, which is to finally come out and publish something together. But I still think it's quite indicative that if you compare it with other disciplines, and that's why I picked deterrence, right? These other articles are not on just anything, they're also about deterrence. And yet, there it looks very different.
Thank you, Stephen. We have a lot of questions, but we have specific questions now in the chat. And one of them, let me first start with the one that is directed for you, Dr. Brusgaard. So this came from the YouTube part from the British Embassy in Moscow. And I read it here. So Kristin focused on deterrence by punishment in her remarks. Can she shed any light on Russian theory of deterrence by denial by reducing Russian vulnerability to attack? So please.
Yeah, so I guess I only mentioned it briefly. I think that the Russian strategic deterrence concept entails both these sort of versions of deterrence by punishment as well as deterrence by denial. I think that, as far as I understand, an improved an improved Russian warfighting capability across the board serves to enhance their deterrence by denial capability, and there are some specific deliberations about how the improvement of air and missile defense capabilities, for example, enhances Russian deterrence capability vis-a-vis a technologically advanced adversary. So I think that the two come hand in hand also in the Russian discussion. I also think that the Russian deliberations regarding the potential of conventional capabilities to inflict unacceptable damage on an adversary, for example, would be also closely related to Russian capabilities to deflect adversary attacks or adversarial retaliation toward Russia. So I think that the two come hand in hand, and I should have emphasized that more if I didn't convey that clearly. So I thank you for the intervention.
Thank you. And then
Let me also throw in here that we've looked at this.
Sorry, there's a question to Pentti, so let's go to that next.
I saw.
It was just a minute. It's
about
about the quick reaction forces.
Was there a question? I don't think so. I can.
Okay, sorry.
I think there
was a comment
from Maxim Shapovalov asked that when I saw the picture of the nuclear deterrence potential, which was divided into 3 categories: strategic, operational, and tactical, and he asked that to speculate on the non-nuclear deterrence potential in the same terms: strategic, operational, tactical. Yes, that's a good question. I think, to my understanding, that the debate and discussion in Russian sources is just about to start to see what it means also for the Russian. But while I mentioned that it was already a few years ago, it was mentioned. So it's a bit earlier than the practical actions or capabilities are already there. So I think the first, what comes to the tactical level or is for the conventional or non-nuclear forces is that was the main idea of the reform after the 2008 and 9. And that element was the very crucial to be built up, and not only, of course, that level is also in other terms it's local level more or less. So that was meant for the local or very near threats to be deterred, and that was the main idea in that sense for the conventional forces or conventional deterrence. How it's used, of course, the limitation is the distance, as I mentioned, that the conventional or the non-nuclear deterrence is mainly at the moment is developing in the strategic level. The new capabilities, which was very clearly shown a few years back by President Putin, for example, they are mainly they can be included to the strategic level of deterrence as well, of course. But the question, I think, is that when it's not as strategic or crucial, the result of the possible use of these weapons, unlike the nuclear weapons, whether it's tactical or strategic, then it's a very interesting question. What will the concept be for the new capabilities which are emerging in Russian military and theoretically how it will be used? Of course, I'd like to approach to the problem from a different point of view. Then, when the non-nuclear forces are more or less, they are local, except of course the air force, the air component or the naval component. Then you have to do something about the mobility. I was mentioning the mobility in my that is one feature of development. What would be happening? Of course, then the question about whether it's Ukraine or even more specifically the Middle East and Syria as a case, as an operation. And then we come to the question, through which glasses do we look at these events happening? Whether we see from the technical military point of view, of if we can assess from the deterrence point of view, it depends on the point of view how we look at the things.
Thank you. We have now some 10 minutes left. And I think we have an excellent question from Fredrik Westerlund from Sweden, and I'd like to take that as the last question that you all would comment. So Fredrik is asking about this, the core dilemma that has been in a way mentioned already in other presentations, that if when the issue is that Russians embrace conflict as a natural part of state interaction that should be managed and controlled rather than avoided, whereas the Western concepts are built on the notion that deterrence is, its function is to avoid the conflict, not to manage it. So we are in a way, and this ties into what Stephen is suggesting, that we would pay attention on how do we know? So how do we know how this our belief systems in a way influence the concepts and the interpretation of the concepts? So my last question to first to Dr. Brusgaard and Pentti, and then Stephen, how can we bridge this gap in the understanding, in the very definition of the things we are here talking about, or is there any possibility for that? And I'm sure we'll come back to this issue later this seminar as well. So Kristin, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Fredrik, for a very good question. So I think it's a pertinent observation. I'm not convinced that, I mean, I think you are right that to observe that it seems as if this Russian concept entails a view of conflict as a more natural state of state interaction. But nevertheless, the Russian concept is also oriented towards seeking to avoid conflict and also seeking to avoid the escalation of conflict. So I think that we shouldn't overstate the differences either, because, or at least as far as I understand, one of the key issues with the Russian concept is precisely that it is designed to prevent the emergence of conflict, but by way perhaps of employing a different set of tools than what we traditionally would think about when we deliberate our own deterrence policies. But I think it's fair to say that, and I think your comment highlights this, that this concept that they are developing indicates certainly perhaps more and more detailed deliberation about the transition between a peaceful relationship and one that's characterized by conflict or even confrontation. And in this domain, I think that there is a perhaps a stark difference to several Western countries where we have perhaps been thinking less about that transition and how precisely we manage that transition and try to avoid the significant escalation of a conflict that may emerge. I'm not entirely sure. So yeah, so I guess that would be one way of saying that we could seek to bridge the gap without perhaps taking it too far. Or I mean, at least a lot of people would warn against a full sort of Western adaptation of the Russian concept, because as I also alluded to in my remarks, I think that there are several problems and problematic aspects with the Russian concept that are yet to be resolved, and that raise questions about, you know, what the effect of this different type of deterrent action that they imagine will actually have on an adversary and on crisis dynamics. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Brusgaard. That was very, very good intervention. Now we have 5 minutes, so I would ask Pentti for one minute last words, and same, Stephen, for you.
Yeah, I fully support what Kristin said about the overstating of the problems. As Russian also I see that the Russian concept of deterrence is an open spectrum of these, what might be positive or negative ones. They have openly said that, and in written form, and scholars brought it into light, that this is the spectrum of the things what might happen, and that's their understanding of the possible situation in the environment, and we have perhaps a bit narrower approach to the problem, but how can we fill the gap in the understanding is I'm firm supporter of discussion, and I hope that the exchange of opinions and remarks and so on, and I really want to see that in the future we would have a connection in different levels, also with Russian, but in the sense that which Stefan brought up, that the citing different material and brought into practice, not for a limited group of persons, but in a broader sense of the audience. Thank you.
Thank you. And Stefan, very short comment, please.
My quick response would be, for all of these questions of understanding, right, is just the answer is careful mapping. If you want to know something more about, we had a discussion with Michael Kaufman on by the Nile, right? And he was arguing that Russians almost never use it. Well, we found 4 categories of deterrence by the Nile, which were quoted by some military authors, by some civilian authors. Отрицание is an obvious one. Лишение доступа. Убеждение, что атака бесполезна. And we can trace those, and then we can look who wrote that, right? If you know the author, and if you know where they come from, it's a military author, it's a Navy author, or it's a Russian academic citing a Western military. All those things can be done. And the great thing about the CNA report is that they actually started doing that in a more sort of qualitative way. So they took an Excel spreadsheet and said, this document says this, has this understanding of this concept, and did a good job writing it out. But I still think we can do this a lot more systematically. And that's what I'll end with the thing I started with. We really need to collaborate more with taking advantage of the new tools that are out there. They're not a panacea, but we all look for sources, and these things really can help us, not only finding them, but also processing them and sharing them more quickly with each other to see how we understand their understandings.
Yes, thank you. That was an excellent ending to our panel. I would like to thank all the speakers and all the excellent questions that we got, and the audience out there. So let's continue. Soon Pentti will have a last word.
Yeah, I just want to mention that via the Zoom channel there are some 40 participants, and in the YouTube channel there are a bit more than 70 persons watching our seminar. So
we continue at 1 o'clock Finnish time. So thank you. See you soon.